so moving over to video number 2, so I just want to kind of talk about the article entitled A Unifying Theory for Autism, a Pathogenetic Triad as a Theoretical Framework by Darko Sarovic, published in Frontiers in Psychiatry, November 2021. So I guess it's the full article, okay? So, the key points. The autistic personality represents a common core condition which induces a set of behavioural issues when pronounced. These issues are compensated for by cognitive mechanisms, allowing the individual to remain functional. It presents the broader autism phenotype as a non-pathological core personality domain, shared across the population and uncoupled from associated features such as low cognitive ability. Common genetic variants underlie the personality domain, and that rare variants act as additional risk factors. The model outlines a common pathophysiological mechanism through inhibition of neurodevelopment, by which a wide range of risk factors lead to autism. Contributing risk factors are clinically ascertained, rather than a part of a core autism construct. No universal risk factor accounts for all autism cases. So to summarise, I guess what he's saying is that there is a common core personality construct which has as its cause these common genetic variants which exist in the general population and do not in and of themselves result in a harmful disability. And indeed, they're basically, just like a personality construct. It's a personality dimension, a bit like introversion or extroversion. We also have an autistic personality dimension, which where you have multiple different genes interacting, common genetic variants, which are behind this core condition, but then you have a wide variety of additional risk factors which can then make this personality more pronounced, and if it's pronounced enough, then a diagnosis will be reached. So I guess this kind of ties into what one of you was saying in the comments, is I think, reading the full article, I think it is allowed for, I think the article does agree with what you were trying to say about similar factors contributing to both clinical autism and the autistic personality. But I think that is basically what the article is saying, that they're both caused by similar things, but when enough risk factors interact with that personality, the person then might, but obviously it's a might because it depends on how many factors there are and how they interact, might then just be pushed over that threshold and a diagnosis of autism is reached. So there's a common autism core. This is not intrinsically pathological, but it constitutes an obligate first hit. So in other words, you have to have the common autistic personality, the common autism core, in order to be autistic. If there's no autistic personality there, regardless of what other impairments a person has, they will not be diagnosed autistic. That's a prerequisite. You have to have the autistic personality. But in and of itself, that's not enough for you to have a diagnosis. You could just have the autistic personality and be fine, just bumbling along through life, no disability, not even really thinking about yourself as autistic because you're functioning fine, and then you might have a child who ends up clinically autistic, maybe. So this autistic personality is abundant in the general population. It doesn't necessarily mean the person will get a diagnosis of autism, though. But then we have cognitive compensation. This is an index of executive function and IQ. Then we have risk factors, which represent a neuropathological burden, and this is a third hit. And this can inhibit the cognitive compensation. The intensity of the autistic personality depends on the genetic load from common variants, and it correlates positively with the quantity and intensity of expressed autistic-like traits and the risk of a diagnosis. The autistic personality presents with issues and strengths that are qualitatively similar to the diagnostic criteria. High verbal IQ, theory of mind, and empathising ability all ameliorate the issues of social communication, so they provide some degree of compensation, and well-developed non-social executive functions, such as working memory and inhibitory control, allow the individual to deal with sensory disturbance and digressions from repetitive behaviours while maintaining thought processes, making them appear less autistic. Risk factors disrupt the normal processes of brain development and lower the protection offered by compensation. So that's interesting. So this will explain why in clinical populations there is an ascertainment bias towards individuals with very low cognitive ability, and you have a very high incidence of intellectual disability among diagnosed autistic people. And this is an ascertainment bias because if someone has an intellectual disability, that reduces their ability to compensate, and that makes it more likely that they will be diagnosed autistic, because that's a risk factor for diagnosis. Whereas the autistic personality itself is not correlated with low cognition. But if you do have low cognition and you have an autistic personality, you are more likely to be diagnosed, and that is why there's an ascertainment bias towards intellectual disability in clinically diagnosed autism. However, it's also possible to be diagnosed autistic and to have a very high IQ, clearly. And this would then suggest that for those people, other factors reducing compensation are at play, for example, reduced executive functions. So although they have a high IQ, which provides some compensation, which is why individuals with Asperger's, who often have higher IQs, tend to appear less autistic than those with an intellectual disability, simply because they're better at compensating for the autistic personality, may still meet the threshold and still be diagnosed autistic, because that verbal compensation is just not enough to completely compensate for the personality, the autistic personality, because of reduced executive functions, working memory, and so on, which can also lower their compensatory ability. So yeah, very interesting. I have a high verbal IQ, so this enables me to compensate to some extent, say more than someone who doesn't have a good verbal IQ. Unfortunately, it also has the effect that other people overestimate my ability, don't necessarily make allowances for my autism because they think, oh yeah, she can talk, so it can actually become kind of a bit of a disability in and of itself in a weird way. But it allows me to compensate in the sense that I can use my high verbal IQ to memorise certain social scripts, which can allow me to kind of, compensate in that way through just rote memorisation, but without really understanding the social situation. Someone without a good verbal intelligence won't be able to do that. However, I really struggle with theory of mind. My verbal ability to some extent allows me to compensate for that. So if I didn't have a good verbal ability, that would be more pronounced, because although I do have a theory of mind deficit, my verbal ability allows me to compensate for that to some extent through sort of like intellectual memorisation and working it out intellectually, although it's obviously very tiring. But I really struggle with the empathising thing, and I also really struggle with processing speed, working memory, and inhibitory control. So executive functions, very poor, particularly in the social arena. And I think that obviously reduces my compensatory ability and has contributed to me getting an autism diagnosis, ultimately pushing me over into impairment. And I do think that these people who are highly successful, generally speaking, have a lot better executive functioning, a lot better theory of mind, a lot better social empathy, and a lot higher non-verbal abilities as well, which enables them to compensate far better than I can. And I do feel that some of them, by the way, probably shouldn't actually be diagnosed, but might still have that autistic personality. And maybe we just need a different name to help them, because they might still need an explanation and support, but maybe not all of them should actually be diagnosed autistic if they're functioning that well. But anyway, so risk factors disrupt the normal process of brain development and lower the protection offered by compensation. And social cognitive personality characteristics are also present in neurotypicals. So the social cognitive personality characteristics of autism are also present in neurotypicals. So autistic-like traits is a common distribution throughout the normal population. When you get a very high level of autistic-like traits, then you have a broader autism phenotype. And the broader autism phenotype is the defining feature of that which is inherently autistic. It's a personality dimension that's not intrinsically pathological. A pronounced broader autism phenotype results in an autistic personality. Okay, so autistic-like traits are dispersed on a dimension through the general population. People with a very high number of autistic traits are described as being broader autism phenotype, and they're more likely in family members of autistic people. If you have a very intense broader autism phenotype personality, if a broader autism phenotype is intense enough, then a person will be described as having an autistic personality. An autistic personality dimension is a little bit like psychoticism, which is another hypothesised personality dimension underlying schizophrenia, which suggests that that psychoticism is also dispersed on a continuum throughout the general population. Openness to ideas and things like that, I think, is one of the traits of psychoticism. So autistic personality might be similar to psychoticism as being an underlying dimension. Pronounced personality types result in either an autistic personality or schizotypy. Schizotypy being the personality underlying schizophrenia, but isn't actually schizophrenia. And when maladaptive, so for example resulting in mental health problems, you end up with an autistic and a schizotypal personality disorder. So it only becomes a disorder when it's maladaptive, but that still might not necessarily be a clinical syndrome. That could just be, so this is a hypothesised autistic personality disorder for those who have problems, but not to the extent of meeting a clinical threshold for diagnosable autism. Autistic personality disorder, sounds quite good. Although I don't think I'll go down well with the neurodiversity movement. With the diagnostic criteria of the field, you end up with either autism or schizophrenia, depending upon whether or not you're on the autistic personality dimension or the psychoticism dimension. Both of these are personality dimensions or traits that exist in the general population. Even though individuals with autistic personality may experience mental health issues, a diagnosis of autism isn't necessarily justified. If you have a pronounced broader autism phenotype, you will then be an autistic personality type. A pronounced personality, when compensatory abilities are low, results in a diagnosis of autism. And camouflaging, by the way, is another example of compensation, or higher order compensation, or masking as it's called. Someone with very high IQ may still have a diagnosis in the presence of more pronounced autistic personality and or deficits in some executive functions. So I guess it's a bit like me. I've got a good verbal ability, but I have very weak executive functioning abilities, a pronounced autistic personality, and I also have a very low non-verbal IQ, and so I'm impaired and therefore got diagnosed. So it suggests here a singular core condition at the genetic level moderated via risk factors. So that's basically the article condensed. So let me know what you think, and thank you for watching.